Amen and amen. Welcome back to the book of Acts. Paul stands trial before a new name that you've not encountered, other than just in passing last week, Festus. So last week we saw Paul's trial before the Roman governor named Felix, the procurator named Felix. As we mentioned, that trial occurred in Caesarea. That's an artist's rendition of Caesarea. You see the theater there, Herod's palace there, the hippodrome there, and there's the port actually. Here's what it looks like today. There's the remains of the theater, the remains of Herod's palace. Sandy and I have been here. It is amazing to stand there and look at the pool that overlooked the Mediterranean Ocean. I mean, this was quite a plush place that Herod built. And then we talked about the hippodrome. They did chariot races in the hippodrome. Many Christians gave their lives for the faith in the hippodrome there in Caesarea. But we are back in Caesarea, but this time it's not with Felix, it's with a man named Festus. Now, following last week, we saw that trial. We saw that the Jews launched these false charges, these fake charges, these contrived charges, these exaggerated charges against Paul before the Roman governor. But we also saw Paul's 11-point defense. He really just stuck to the truth. He really just walked through the facts. He really just dealt with everything they had said and how false it was. He even dealt with what even brought him to Jerusalem. It wasn't to cause a riot or an insurrection. He actually brought aid to Jerusalem to help the poor saints out. So he covered all that. Ultimately, we're certain Felix recognized he was not guilty of any crime. But yet Felix held him. Ultimately, a couple of days later, Felix and his wife Drusilla, we met her last week, they brought Paul out and asked Paul to speak about his faith in Jesus Christ. Can you imagine that opportunity? To be brought before the most powerful man in that region, the procurator, the governor over Judea, with the free slate, talk to us about your faith, what you believe about this person, Jesus Christ. And if you remember, he spoke to them about three topics: righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. Now, we know for sure that for that third point hit home. The Bible tells us, Luke records, that Felix was afraid. Felix sensed the weight of God's coming judgment. Felix sensed the fact that he was not right before God, but rather than repent, rather than place faith in Jesus Christ, he pushed Paul away. And he said, I'll hear you again later, a better, a more opportune time. Pushing away the gospel and pushing away eternal life. We have no indication that he ever came to faith in Jesus Christ. Ultimately, though, what Festus would do is hear Paul quite regularly. He would bring him and talk to him, but that's because Luke tells us he was hoping to get money. He wanted Paul to give him some money, and then he was going to let him go. Again, we talked about Felix. He was a scoundrel. We ended last week with this verse. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, the next governor, the next procurator of Judea, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Now, Felix was being recalled by the Emperor Nero. He was being recalled for his poor ruling of the area of Judea, and in particular, Jerusalem. Festus was the new governor that Nero appointed. So he recalled Felix, and as you can imagine, Festus is going into a little bit of a swirl. There's some problems happening in Jerusalem. They resulted, and in the area of Judea, they resulted in the last procurator getting fired by the Caesar. And so you can imagine that he wants Jack to start out on the right foot, to start out on a good foot. And so that's where we find ourselves. Now, if you're like me, in one sense, you're like, another false trial? Another trial with no eyewitnesses and no legitimate claims? I don't know how many more of these I can take. Rich, can we just kind of give us a capsule of it and run on? Get to something really fantastic? Well, I would just say this. I would encourage you to look for the moral and spiritual lessons throughout this trial. There are numerous. They are woven through this trial, both good and bad. Both you should do this and you should not do that. So look for those things. Look for those things you take home with you as points of application. Look beyond the trial. It's true, but find the things you take home and live out or avoid living out. So with all that, in your notes, you do have a 10-point outline of chapter 25. So we're back in Caesarea. Felix has been fired. Festus has been appointed. Paul has been left to do the Jews a favor in prison, house arrest to be technical, be exact. Any questions before we get going? Okay. So last week, if you remember, I did something I normally don't do, and that's introduce the characters to you in advance. I wanted you to have some background so that when you read the story, you had the background in advance. I want to do that again this morning. The first character I want you to meet is a guy named Porcius Festus. We mentioned him. I've already talked about him. He's Felix's replacement. His full name is Porcius Festus. Little is known about him, but overall history reports that he was a fair and reasonable leader. Unlike his predecessor, Felix, who history reports was a scoundrel. Everyone you read behind caused lots of problems in Jerusalem. But it seems that Festus's reign was plagued by problems that Felix created and problems that King Agrippa would create in reference to the high priest and the office of the high priest. That'll all play out in our lesson. But his reign, although history is fair to him, the problems he inherited and then some were occurring in Jerusalem because of things King Agrippa was doing. Interesting, he only ruled for 2 years and then he died. History doesn't tell us how he died or what took his life, only that he only reigned as the procurator over Judea for 2 years. So to look at our timeline, and by the way, this document is up on our miscellaneous handouts, we're here at the end of Paul's house arrest in Caesarea. So around 59 to 60 AD, you can see we're at the point where Festus becomes the governor. Festus becomes the procurator. Just in passing, notice who is the emperor at this time? Nero, thank you very much. And he began to reign in 54 AD. So just get all that in your mind. So the first character we run into is this guy named Porcius Festus. Forgive the picture. That's not his picture. That's actually Festus. I meant to get that fixed. Sorry. Please forgive me. So if this is on video, hey, I know it's not the right picture. Forgive me.
They were twins.
They were twins. Not hard. The next guy we'll talk about is the guy I just mentioned in passing, King Agrippa II. King Agrippa II, or Herod Agrippa II, was born in 27 AD. Now, you remember the family of the Herods. In the Bible, we were introduced to Herod the Great. You remember him. What notorious thing, what wicked thing was he involved in? The execution, Janice gave it to me, the execution of the babies in Jerusalem, 2 years old and below, in an attempt to kill the baby Jesus, the one who was born King of the Jews. So we met him. Well, he's the great-grandfather of the guy we're looking at today, Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa II's grandfather, Aristobulus, was actually murdered by his dad, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was worried that Aristobulus was trying to seize power, so he is one of his 3 sons that he had murdered. This is the Herods, by the way. So that's his great-grandfather. His grandfather, let's talk about his great-uncle, Herod Antipas. Whether you know his great-uncle or not, you know his great-uncle. His great-uncle is the one who had John the Baptist beheaded. That was his great-uncle. His great-uncle is the one who Pilate sent Jesus to, and then he mocked him and sent him back to Pilate, and they were friends ever since. That's Herod Antipas. That's this man's great-uncle. And then let's talk about his dad. We've met his dad here in the book of Acts, Herod Agrippa I. He's the one who in Acts 12 killed James the apostle. He locked Peter up intending to kill him. Herod Agrippa I has the distinction of being the man who executed the first apostle. In fact, as far as we know, the first martyr of the Christian church. That's the family of the Herods. That's the guy we run into today. His great-grandfather, dad, that's Herod Agrippa II. And he will show up in our text here in a moment. Now, in the text, he's called King Agrippa. And the reason he's called King Agrippa is when he was 17, at 17 his father died. And at the time, Claudius was the emperor. And Claudius thought he was too young to be placed in charge of anything. So Claudius held him back until he was 21. At 21, Claudius appointed him as the king of Chalcis, this little region to the north of Israel. Thus, he indeed is a king. Shortly after that, he resigned, stepped away from his kingship, and he was appointed Philip's old assignments, those that are in yellow, and he was appointed ruler over those regions that originally belonged to Philip. A little bit later, he was appointed ruler over this area to the west, to the west of the Sea of Galilee, and then to the east of the Dead Sea. And then a little bit later after that, because of his supposed Jewish knowledge, he was appointed in charge of the high priests that were in Jerusalem. This would become a big deal. It would become problematic because he would replace multiple high priests with people that he chose. Obviously, that didn't sit well with the Jews. So during our time of the reign of the procreator, who is Festus, the whole time the hatred between the Jews and Rome continues to build, not because of what he's doing, but because of the kingdom he inherited from Felix and what Agrippa's doing. So the nation of Israel is on boil with the nation of Rome, all because of what's going on. Also, in our text this morning, we'll run into one other person. She happens to be a Herod. Now, last week, if you remember, we ran into Felix. Does anybody remember his wife's name? Her name was Drusilla, whoever said it. Now, Drusilla is Agrippa II's daughter or sister. So last week we ran into Drusilla, who was married to Felix, who was the emperor at the time, or excuse me, the procurator at the time, and that is Agrippa II's sister. Today we run into his other sister, Bernice. This is Agrippa II's sister. Okay, so Bernice, by all accounts, was a very beautiful woman, married a few times. Following her second marriage, she moved in with her brother, Herod Agrippa II. It's rumored that during this time she had an incestuous relationship with her brother, the man we will meet today, and we'll meet her, Herod Agrippa II. She then left him, got married to a third husband, divorced him, and she moved back in with Agrippa II. And again, it is rumored that she had an incestuous relationship with him. Many more scandalous things we could say about her. I'll just end there because we've heard enough. In all ways, she was from the Herod family. Very wicked woman. Today, we will run into Bernice traveling with her brother, Agrippa II, interestingly enough. So goes the life of the Herods. Okay, that sets us up for verse 1. Are there any questions about where we are, who's in charge, what's going on, the players, and their character? Okay, let's get at it. Verse 1. Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Okay, so we get what's going on. Nero has dispatched Festus. There's been problems. He's fired Felix. He's recalled him to Rome. He gets to Caesarea, but he quickly, after a turnover, after he surveys the land, after whatever, he quickly goes where? Up to Jerusalem. Now, it's up in elevation. It's actually south in geography, but it's up in elevation. So you can sense from the text, he understands that a good relationship with Israel is important. They're a block of people. There's been problems with Rome. The last guy got fired because of these problems in Judea and Jerusalem. He wants to get off on a good start. He wants to start a good relationship with his subjects. So shortly after going to Caesarea, surveying the land, he immediately heads off to Jerusalem, as we might imagine that he would. And that brings us to verse 2. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. And they urged him, that would be Festus, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem because they were planning to ambush him. They were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Okay, I need to slow down. There's a number of things you need to know right here. Number one, Festus arrives in Jerusalem, and we're told that the chief priest and the principal men lay out their case against Paul. So let's talk about that. The chief priests were likely the 24 leaders of the Levitical priesthood. They were likely all Sadducees. Principal men could have been other Pharisees, could have been the rest of the Sanhedrin, could have been other Sadducees, could have been any combination thereof. The reason many scholars don't believe it was all of the Sanhedrin is because Luke doesn't mention the council, which he mentions 14 times in the book of Acts whenever he's talking about the Sanhedrin. So likely it wasn't all of the Sanhedrin, but here's the point. Festus gets to Jerusalem, and immediately he's met with these Jewish religious leaders. And what you're going to see as this text plays out is the first thing they say is, listen, you've got this scoundrel who did all these bad things. You need to execute him now. Festus doesn't go for that. Festus, that's nothing like Festus is going to do. So then what they do is they ask a favor. And you'll see this play out, but you see the favor here. They said, okay, if you won't execute him now for his high crimes and misdemeanors, then how about this? You bring him to Jerusalem and try him here, and then you can execute him here. But you see, Luke tells us that wasn't at all what they were worried about. They were not worried about justice. They were worried about ambushing Paul on the way. They were worried about killing Paul. They were not worried about justice. Now, pause. This is extremely sad. These are some of the leading religious, political, spiritual leaders in the nation of Israel. And not only are they lying on the charges of Paul, it's much bigger than that. They're setting up a condition with the new procurator where they intend to ambush Paul as he's executed from Caesarea to Jerusalem. They are not worried about justice. They are worried about putting Paul to death. And so they lay out this plan, which is all just a ruse to get Festus to bring Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem. This is a wicked conspiracy. The charges are all lies, but it's much bigger than that. These religious leaders want to murder in cold blood a fellow Jew. That's how far these religious leaders have slid from Yahweh. That's how far they've drifted from God. They plan to kill him on the way. This is identical, or at least very close, to the same conspiracy that got Paul to Caesarea in the first place. If you remember then, it was 40 men who took an oath that they would not eat or drink until they had put Paul to death. Lysias, the commander of the garrison, learned about it, and so he had Paul shuttled off to Caesarea. Here, it's not 40 assassins. It's the leading religious leaders of the day. That's the sad condition we find ourselves in. Now, I do want to make a point so that you don't miss it. Have you ever considered, as Paul is languishing away in jail, house arrest for the last 2 years, that not only is he languishing away in jail, he is being divinely protected by a sovereign God. You see, when we think of divine protection, we often think of it in a very comfortable situation, in a very cushy chair. That's not the situation that Paul is in, but he is being divinely protected. And more than that, he is being divinely protected there with the intent, God has the intent to bring before him audience of some of the most powerful men and military leaders of the day so that they hear a clear presentation of the gospel. That's the loving kindness of our God. In spite of Felix being a bad person, he heard the gospel. In spite of Agrippa too and all that he's involved in, he's next week going to hear the clearest presentation of the gospel that we see in any of these defenses by Paul. That is the goodness and the kindness of God. They will hear the gospel. Now let me ask you a question. It's clear the Jews who did not place faith in Jesus Christ, the Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, hated Paul. Why? Why did they hate him? As you're pondering how you want to answer that, I would remind you of what Jesus said. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own, but because you are not of the world, because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said unto you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, says Jesus, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. Why did they hate Paul? Because they hated Jesus. Why do you feel like some people hate you? Because they hate Jesus and they can't get to him. Rich, microphone's on the way.
Every time I hear and read something that Paul spoke and shared and the reaction to it, I think about the fact that he was the Lord High Executioner for the Jews. This was someone they counted on to eliminate the threat of the way, the threat of Christians.
Yep.
And they placed a lot of trust in him and a lot of authority in him. And who's the one who's doing the most to be sure that the way becomes the way for so many people, Jews and Gentiles alike? So they have the Lord High Executioner, who is now the mouthpiece of the Lord and the effective mouthpiece of the Lord, who never shrinks from an opportunity to proclaim the good news.
And they hated him.
How
many people who know who Richard Dawkins is? Richard Dawkins? Outspoken atheist, many years, many books. Imagine, we'll do the opposite. Imagine if Richard Dawkins came to faith in Jesus Christ. I can promise you one thing. All of his atheistic friends would hate him because of his voice and his platform, because of who he was. And you're right, Rich, that's part of what was going on here. But I would remind you, as you think about how much they hated him, I would remind you of what he said about them. Romans 9. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I myself could wish that I were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. Did you hear what Paul said? Paul said if it were possible, I would trade my salvation for theirs. That's how much I love them. And yet, every time he talked to them, if they did not believe in Jesus, they were trying to knock his teeth down their throat. But his love for them was unwavering. And I guess at that point, I would just remind all of us. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends his rain on the just and the unjust. You see, Paul was modeling exactly what Jesus said to do. And it's a great reminder. You and I are called to love our enemies. We're called to pray for those who despitefully use us. God just may use us to bring the gospel into their heart and birth them into the kingdom of Christ. But following the request to bring to bring Paul to Jerusalem, Festus says this, verse 4. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself, Festus, intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me. And if there's anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. So he says, listen. And he did it in two phases. You'll see it soon enough. He said, I'm not going to kill him without a trial as a Roman citizen. Sorry. Number two, I'm not going to bring him from Caesarea to here. If there's charges to be made, I'm going to Caesarea soon, in about a week and a half, as it turns out. Come with me, lay the charges out. I'll set on my tribunal. I'll give a judgment, and that'll be the deal. That's his proposal. I want you to keep this in mind. They proposed to bring Paul to Jerusalem. What did he propose? No. Jerusalem is not the seat of the Roman government. The seat of the Roman government is Judea. He will stand trial before me in in Caesarea. I want you to keep that in mind and watch how it plays out. But he gives an alternative plan for the men, and they have no choice. It is interesting, isn't it? After 2 years of imprisonment, 2 years, the wound is like it was yesterday. They still hate this man, and they want his life, and they're willing to lie. They're willing to kill in cold blood to get it. That's where we find ourselves. Any questions, though? We're about to leave Jerusalem. We're about to go to Caesarea, and we'll see if any Jews accompany Festus or not.
Lori wanted to know if we could have popcorn now.
No popcorn now, sorry. Verse 6. After he stayed, this would be Festus, among them, the Israelites, the Jews, not more than 8 or 10 days, a week and a half, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. Now, as we're looking at these first 6 verses, here's my estimation. Felix appears to be fair. Festus appears to be fair. He appears to be honest. He appears to be an ethical ruler. He's hearing the things, but he's not going to thwart justice. He's not going to bring Paul to Jerusalem. He's not going to turn Paul over to be murdered without Paul facing his charges. And here the Jews come with him, and the very next day, he wastes no time. The very next day, he takes his seat on the tribunal. The court is in session. Paul is brought out before him. The trial is to begin. So everything appears to be above board. He appears to be a good guy. And the mistrial, that's not even a good way to say it, the miscarriage of justice that occurred 2 years ago, it appears is going to be undone. He's going to undo it right here. And that brings us to verse 7. And when he had arrived, that's Festus, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem when Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. So put that in your mind. You got Festus on the tribunal. You got Paul standing in front of him. And you've got all the Jews who came from Jerusalem around him. Now, we don't know how many there were. If it was the entire Sanhedrin, then it would be 71. It would be the high priest and the other 70 of the Sanhedrin, all standing around one man. Look at how Luke describes it. And they began bringing many and serious charges against him. Imagine what that looked like. Imagine you're that man, and around you is, let's say, up to 71 people who are all hurling multiple and false charges against you before the most powerful man, one of the most powerful men you've ever stood before. And here you are, and they're all just barraging these serious charges. By the way, the Greek word for serious is barus. It means weighted. It means heavy. They were bringing heavy lies against Paul. They were bringing heavy charges against him. By the way, just as a reminder, these are the spiritual leaders, and they're doing this in an attempt to miscarry justice. Imagine what it was like. They have the numbers on their side. The problem is they don't have the facts, and they don't have eyewitnesses. This is very similar to what we saw before Felix. The big difference was before Felix, they hired a lawyer. They hired a professional speaker, an orator. Here, they seem to be doing it themselves. They said, that didn't work well, we'll do it ourselves. And I would just say in passing, at least by way of application, we should not be surprised when people bring false charges against believers. We see it here in Paul. You can consider Joseph. You can think about Daniel. It's all over the Bible. John MacArthur, and by the way, when I put this quote on, he was nothing late, John MacArthur. He was still John MacArthur. When I prepared your notes, it was still John MacArthur. I want to say this just before I get his quote. We have lost a fantastic expositor of the Scriptures. We've lost an incredible mind, but he's gone home. He has finished his race, and he ran his race well. We should celebrate the life of this man. But at any rate, John MacArthur said this in his commentary. 2 years had passed since Paul's trial before Felix, but they still had no witnesses, no evidence, and thus they had no case. That's all still true. Verse 8. Paul argued in his defense. Here's what he said. Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. You can see what Paul is saying breaks really into three heads. Number one, I've not broken any Jewish law. Now, no doubt this would have been for the 71 or up to 71 who are standing there that have been lobbying all these charges. He's like, listen, it's all a lie. I've broken no Jewish laws. Look at his second point. I've not committed any offense against the temple. Now, the charges, as we think back to Felix, the only charge that was close to having any specificity was the charge they profaned the temple. Now, again, it was not, I'll pause for just a second because that got really loud. Again, it was not true. He had not taken any Gentiles into the temple. They just thought he had done that. It's got a little echo to it now, but yeah, he's getting it. But he had not committed any offense against the temple, and no doubt that was on the behalf of the Jews. But it's his third point that's the biggest one. And I've not broken any of Caesar's laws. I've not broken any Roman laws. He's handling my microphone here. And he pulled my ear, I think. Okay. Number three. He's not broken any Roman laws. This is the drop the mic moment for Festus. This is the whole point. This is a civil trial. This is a Roman trial. And Paul is guilty of no infractions against Rome. This should be mistrial, court adjourned. You're free. Go. We'll see if that plays out. But I do want you to observe something I pointed out last week. I want you to see it again. In spite of all the injustice, in spite of all the false accusations, in spite of being locked up for 2 years, in spite of all this, Paul remains calm. He speaks nothing but the truth. He maintains his integrity. He stands firm in everything. He's a good picture of how we should respond when false accusations are being hurled at us. The truth, very calmly. That's Paul. Now, what you're going to see in the next verse, I'll give you the lead. Festus is on the horns of the same dilemma that Felix was on. Maybe even worse. Festus wants a good start with this nation. Felix got fired because of these people. He wants his subjects to like him to some degree. He wants to rule well with them. But he's got this little problem. Paul appears to be innocent, but they want him to be found guilty. A man of integrity will make the right decision. A man who lacks integrity, we'll see. Verse 9. But Festus, Luke says, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Pause. Before we even unpack this should strike you as like crazy. Now, wait a minute. I thought, as I remember the story, that this was what the Jews proposed in the first place. And Festus said, no, that's not how it's going to work. You'll see what he says here in just a moment, what he said back then. Now we have Festus making this same proposal to Paul. What has changed? I don't know what has changed. I wish I could read his mind. Was he just curious what Paul would say? I don't think so. Was he hoping that he could get Paul to Jerusalem and just sort of turn the whole trial over to the Sanhedrin? And then they would execute him, and he would just sort of wash his hands of this whole thorny little problem, much like Pontius Pilate attempted to do 25 years ago with his Savior. Is that what he was up to? We don't know. We do know he looks at Paul and asks him this crazy question that he had just rejected a week and a half ago outright. Quick question. Knowing everything you know, slide on Paul's sandals for a minute. The most powerful man in the area looks at you and he says, hey, you willing to go to Jerusalem to be tried there? What would you say? We have a no in the back. Verse 10. But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. One man of integrity, standing before the most powerful man, 71, up to 71, hurling accusations at him. And he stands before them boldly, and he says, listen, I am standing in the Roman tribunal, Caesar's tribunal, where I should stand as a Roman citizen who's being accused of breaking Roman laws. I've done no wrong, as you, Festus, yourself know. In front of everybody, he rebuked this young ruler. He said, what are you doing? You know I'm innocent. You know it very well. The Greek there is epignosko. It means to know through learning. It means to know through study. It means to know through research. You see, he knew Kallion very well. He knew very well that Paul was innocent. And Paul has called him out on him. I don't know what Festus or what Paul was thinking, but I suspect he was thinking something like this. If I can't get a fair trial in Caesarea from you, there's no way I'll get it in Jerusalem. I don't know what he's thinking, but I got a feeling, but he does rebuke this young procurator with this crazy question. Verse 11, if then I am a wrongdoer or have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Okay, let's walk through it. So first, you see three big declarations. First, if I'm a wrongdoer, if I've broken Roman law, if I've done something worthy of death, Paul says, I'm ready to die. If I've broken the law and deserve death, I am ready to die. Point number one. Point number two, but if not, if I've not broken the law and I've not done anything worthy of death, then no one can take my life, not even you, Festus. Again, you can picture this thing goes from 0 to 60. First, he rebukes Festus, and then he says, I'm about to remove the authority from you. I'm about to take away your authority. You will not judge rightly. I will take the chance to do it. And he says this, I appeal to Caesar. Fruchtenbaum in his commentary says this, I'll just read it to you. Under Roman law, a Roman citizen who felt he was not receiving fair treatment in a Roman court could appeal to Caesar himself. An appeal to Caesar could be made either before or after a sentence and would always guarantee a further investigation. He was a Roman citizen. This was a right under Roman law, and he executed that right and said, I appeal to Caesar. And at that moment, it was taken out of Festus's hands. Now, you're going to see him converse with some of his counsel, but it's over. He would get in big trouble if it was ever learned someone appealed to Caesar, he didn't send him. But he appealed to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he had that right to do that. Now, why would Paul appeal to Caesar? That's the question maybe we tackle. I don't know, but if you're thinking about it, likely, he probably suspected in a super long trip from Caesarea to Jerusalem, what's going to happen? They're going to try to kill me. Remember, he knew about the plot that was just from the Antonia fortress to the meeting of the Sanhedrin, and there were 40 men who were going to kill him in that little teeny trip, all there in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Imagine a trip that's between 65 and 100 miles. Plenty of opportunities. He probably thought that. Likely, he recognized he would never get a fair trial before Festus. When Festus asked that question, he probably said, not going to happen. Not if you're not going to decide here, it's not going to be fair there. Well, there's another point, isn't there? Paul knew he was going to Rome, didn't he? Jesus had told Paul already. The following night, the Lord stood by him. We read this verse and said to him, take courage, for as you testified to the facts in me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Paul knew he was going to Rome. Now he didn't realize when Jesus said that he was going as a prisoner, Rich. He probably had a better idea. He was probably thinking it'd be a nice leisurely trip. But he was going to Rome, and he was bulletproof until he got there. He was going to declare the gospel before the most powerful man on the planet, before Caesar indeed. And so here, one of those reasons, all three of those reasons, I don't know, but here he appeals to Caesar. Let's make a point of application. Regardless of what the situation looks like, remember Romans 8:28. All things are working together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Never forget that. If we were to look at the situation here, the lies, the scandals, the attempted murders, the mistrials, the jail time, we would say, God's nowhere in this. And yet the whole time, God was sovereignly directing and guiding through it all. Now, there's one more point, and Jack, this is applicable to your upcoming class starting in August on biblical citizenship. Paul was acting as a Roman citizen. He was carrying out what Roman citizens were allowed to do. He was operating within the Roman government as vile and as corrupt as it was. He was appealing to Caesar as he had a right to do. In fact, Romans 13, let every soul be subject unto higher powers. For there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive themselves damnation. Or as the ESV says, judgment. And forgive me, I know a lot of verses in the King James in my head, so I just repeat those. But you get the point. You get what Paul's doing, and you get what we're to do as citizens. Paul is executing his rights, and he's appealing to Caesar. And that brings us to verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Well, of course that was the decision. This guy's been on the job a week and a half. He's been the procurator for like a week and a half, and already he's embroiled in this mess of his own creating because he lacked the integrity to say, listen, I've heard all of this. This man is innocent. Court adjourned. He's out of here. You guys are out of here. Have a nice day. His own indecision, his own unethical behavior has caught him in this dilemma. And here, Paul will be sent to Caesar. The problem is, and you're going to see it play out, what are the charges? What's Paul appealing? You see, there are no legitimate charges. That's the whole problem here. And so now Festus is caught in his own little trap. What is he going to say the charges are that Paul's appealing? Any questions before we see what happens next? Sandy, Mike's coming. Maybe he's coming. I don't know. Mike's coming. There were two coming for a second.
I was just going to make a comment that Roman citizens had a lot of rights. I mean, to be able to do that.
We've talked about some of them along the way. Obviously, a Roman citizen could never be jailed without a hearing. You couldn't just jail a Roman citizen without a hearing first. Roman citizens could never be flogged, could never be scourged. So that crime, or that penalty was considered so heinous that you couldn't even execute that on a Roman citizen, period, ever. Roman citizens had a great deal of benefit. Oh, Rich.
There's been a lot of criticism of our buddy Festus for the fact that he did not fulfill his obligation to do a full investigation of the charges that were levied against Paul, and that he just said, okay, to Caesar you appeal, to Caesar you shall go. And there's also the conjecture that his 2-year tenure might have been reduced to 2 years because of his failure to do his responsibility and being so overly sensitive to why Felix got bounced, that he got bounced as well. And then the second thing is that he's appealing to Caesar, and we look at your chart and we see a name we know really well, and that's Nero.
Nero.
But what we need to remember is that Nero was not the Nero in the first 5 years, which is the time of the appeal. So he's appealing to someone that he believes is a reasonable, honest, and fair emperor.
That's correct.
When we hear Nero, we think,
Christian hater, notorious.
Fiddler extraordinary.
Correct.
So,
and you're exactly right, Rich. At this point in history, Nero was considered a fair, honest, ethical ruler. That would change over time. But he appeals to Caesar. You see what's going on, and that brings us to verse 13. Now, when some days had passed, we don't know how many, a week, 2 weeks, a month, we don't know. When some days had passed, Agrippa the king, here we go, and Bernice, there we go, his sister, traveling with him, arrived in Caesarea and greeted Festus. We don't know why they came, likely just to welcome the new procurator, likely, hey, welcome to the area, just a little celebration. But Agrippa II, Herod Agrippa II, still referred to as the king because of his time over Chalcis, and Bernice, his sister, arrived in Caesarea and greeted Festus. Verse 14. And as they stayed there many days, so we don't know how long, but it was a while, Festus, as he's likely taking all this in, by the way, Paul is still being held even though he's appealed to Caesar, Festus laid out Paul's case before King Agrippa, saying, there's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I told you that would come around. So that he's retelling the story, except for picking up additional detail. When I went to Jerusalem, all right, even back it up, there's this guy who's being held from when Felix was in charge. He just left him as my problem. And when I went to Jerusalem, they immediately accosted me and said, hey, you need to pronounce a sentence of condemnation against this guy. You need to execute this heinous criminal. Again, you can see their hatred for him. Now, this is not surprising because Festus is a brand new governor. He's just came from Rome. This whole area is new to him. Agrippa II is a seasoned leader. He's familiar with the Jews. He'll know what to do. He'll hear all this and make sense of it. So Festus brings in Agrippa and says, hey, got a little thorny problem I want to talk to you about. And it's this guy named Paul, left over by Felix, who the Jews wanted me to pass a sentence of condemnation. Verse 16. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So we didn't get this the first pass from Luke, but here we get it as recorded when Festus is having this conversation with Agrippa. And he's saying, hey, first they wanted me to just kill him. I said, that's not going to happen. Then they said, okay, bring him here, and we'll lay accusations against him. And he said, listen, I'm not doing any of that. I'm not killing him because in Rome, everyone has the right to meet their accusers face to face. They have an opportunity to offer a defense to the charges. So ultimately, they decided to come with me here, verse 17. And when they came together here, I made no delay, Festus said. But on the next day, the very next day after arriving, I took my seat on the tribunal and I ordered the man, Paul, to be brought forth. So Festus is just reciting, he's rehearsing everything that went on. We're picking up some additional details as he goes. But again, he's just saying, listen, here's what happened. Here's what I did. He's coming to the thorny problem. Verse 18. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Okay, now picture what he just said. In his mind, he's thinking this guy is a notorious assassin. He's killed multiple people. He's robbed. He's raped. He's pillaged. He's done all these things. But when they leveled the charges against him, it was none of these evils as I supposed. 19. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion. and about a certain Jesus who was dead, that's what they said, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Okay, now this is entertaining if nothing else. Festus, in hearing everything, was able to see through it all. Look at how he's describing to Agrippa what went down. He's describing to Agrippa when all the charges were laid out, here's what it looked like. This was nothing more than questions about the Jewish religion. There was no Roman law being broken here. There was nothing deserving of someone being imprisoned or death. This was all matters of the Jewish faith. I'm like, what are you guys? Surely he's thinking, what are you doing here? Oh, and there was one other point. There was some big dispute about a guy called Jesus, who they kept saying was dead, and Paul kept saying he was alive. Isn't it interesting that everywhere Paul went, before his presentation of the gospel was over, he made this point: Jesus rose from the grave. So much so that this man, who had very little contact with the Jewish faith and even less with the Christian faith, after hearing Paul's defense and after hearing everything they said, understood these 2 points. This whole dispute seems to be about some religious stuff between them two and about this guy named Jesus, who Paul keeps saying is alive. Now, I've said it before, but it's worthy of repeating. For Paul, for the Bible, for you and I, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is inseparably linked to our resurrection. Because he rose from the grave, one day we will rise from the grave. Because his resurrection is true, we can be certain our resurrection will be true. Another set of verses, still from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul said this: "For as by one man came death," and that one man is Adam. Adam, our federal head. When he sinned, sin spread through his whole race. When he died, we were born dead. "For as by one man came death, by one man, by a man, came also the resurrection of the dead." Now, who's he talking about? He's talking about our second federal head. He's talking about the Lord Jesus Christ. Through Jesus came death came from Adam. The resurrection of the dead came from Jesus. Verse 22. "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Those who are in Christ will one day be resurrected to eternal life, but each in his own order. Christ, the first fruits, then in his coming, all those who belong to Christ." You see, Paul connects the resurrection of Jesus Christ to our resurrection. Because Paul was certain Jesus has rose from the grave, he is certain that one day you and I will rise from the grave. That's the position of the scriptures. That's the position that Paul lays out. But in all this, you should see this: Festus is miffed. What is going on here, and why is he even here? It's what's confusing to us, maybe not, is why he didn't find him innocent, because he knew he was guilty of no charges. Verse 20, Festus continues, "Being at a loss how to investigate these questions." Pause. I'm sure Agrippa said, "Why are you even worried about those questions? Those questions have nothing to do with Roman law. Why are you at a loss about investigating those questions? You can investigate those questions. Those are important questions. Those are life-altering questions. Those are the biggest questions you'll ever face, but they have nothing to do with his guilt or innocence." But at any rate, this is what Festus said to Agrippa. "Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them." Man, I wonder what Agrippa thought to that. Surely Agrippa said, "Why did you ask him that? If he's innocent, is he innocent in Caesarea? And if he's guilty, isn't he guilty in Caesarea? And if he's innocent in Caesarea, isn't he innocent in Jerusalem? How does a change of venue change anything here?" I'm sure Agrippa, with much more experience, but see, Agrippa's not over the horns of the problem, to go with what Rich was saying. Agrippa's not wrestling with keeping your subjects compliant and happy and in line. He's not wrestling with these things. And he's not likely a man of much integrity, and so he's caught in the middle of it all. So being at a loss how to investigate, he asked whether he would go. I'm sure Agrippa said, "I don't even understand the question, but okay." And that brings us to verse 21. "But when Paul appealed to be kept in their custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar." Now, we don't know how much time has passed, whether it's weeks or months, but here Paul is sitting in Caesarea, and the reason he's sitting, and you'll see it in a second, is because Festus does not know what to write about him. Festus does not know how to codify the charges against him. So he's just sort of stuck here. But as fate would have it, Agrippa shows up. And Agrippa's extremely experienced with the Jews, and Agrippa hopefully can help him out. Darrell Bach writes this in his commentary, looking at the word here as it said that he appealed to the emperor. The Greek word or term is the official Greek equivalent of the Latin Augustus, worthy to be worshipped. Its use for the emperor dates back to Octavian in 27 BC. And by the way, it is a title that Nero would take for himself. But at any rate, this is a correct term to call the Caesar. And he said, hey, I'm waiting. I'm holding him here because I've got to send him to the emperor for a decision. But I think we still know what's really going on here. Going back to verse 9, Festus wishing to do the Jews a favor. You see, Festus knows in his heart of hearts Paul is innocent. But he wants to appease these Jews. And he's considering miscarrying justice to do it. That's where we're at. Verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. You can picture this. He's like, this is crazy. I would like to hear that man. And then Festus responds, tomorrow you will hear him. I'll march him out tomorrow. The prisoner, Paul, is about to be provided another opportunity to speak to yet another powerful man about the gospel of Jesus Christ. In this case, it will be Agrippa II. Festus will be there, and as you'll see in a second, many military leaders will be present. Again, we see the goodness of God. Men who might not have otherwise ever heard the gospel because of their political position and power are brought before Paul, who will preach the gospel to everyone he runs into. And they're about to hear a wonderful testimony of Paul's conversion and a wonderful declaration of the gospel from the mouth of Paul. That's what's coming next week. And so I would say this, if you know someone who's lost or still wrestling with who Jesus is, next week's a good lesson. Acts 26, as Paul describes his conversion, and then he describes the gospel. It is a beautiful presentation. It's not your testimony in this case, it'll be Paul's testimony. And Paul's declaration of the gospel. The ESV Study Bible, my ESV Study Bible, has this note on this point. It says, amid considerable pomp, and you'll see that in 1 second, Paul testified before the king in fulfillment of 9:15. Of the three defense speeches, the one in chapter 22 before the Sanhedrin, the one in chapter 24 before Felix, the one coming next week before Agrippa in chapter 26, this one before Agrippa next week gives the most detailed explanation of the gospel. Indeed, it will. You'll love it. Again, I would say bring someone who doesn't know Jesus. It is a great chapter. Any questions before we advance the story and get to the end of our lesson today? Oh, Jen.
It's kind of a simple question. All right, the passage you just went over is a conversation between Agrippa and Festus.
That's correct. Festus and Agrippa.
Right. So is this like divinely written by Luke? How does he know the conversation?
Great question, Janice. We often don't know how Luke got his information. So he has a lot of information, like things that the Sanhedrin said when they were in council. So likely Luke interviewed people. So likely Luke interviewed one of the servants that was there to hear the conversation. It's unlikely Agrippa or Festus talked to him. He wouldn't have had an audience with him. But you find throughout the book of Acts, it's like he's a fly on the wall for some amazing conversations. But if you go back to both the Gospel of Luke and Acts, he interviewed people, he talked to people, and then wrote the narrative. So he likely talked to someone who overheard the conversation.
Wouldn't Luke have talked to Paul as well?
He would have.
And isn't Acts, they figure, a legal document for him to take to Rome for his defense? So this is all playing a part of that answer.
Well, so yes, and let me say a few things there, because you said a number of things that are important. So number one, it's unlikely that Paul was here for this conversation, right? Because this conversation appears to be in the palace between Agrippa the king, former king, and Festus the governor. So likely it was a house servant that overheard this. But now to go to what you said, many believe that Acts and even Luke were both written to be sent to the emperor in Paul's defense. Many people believe that Luke recorded all of this to record all the details as a defense for Paul. There's a number of reasons. I don't want to get into them now. We don't have time. But you're exactly right. And many people believe that, good people. And there's probably some truth behind